Hello and welcome back to the May Day celebrations happening at the May Day Bookstore. Of course, it's not happening inside the bookstore because we are under lockdown, but we are very happy, privileged, honored to have with us the poet Martin Espada.
Thank you. Uh, First of all, happy May Day, everyone. I would like to thank VJ Prashad and everyone at Leftward Books for this unique opportunity to talk to you this evening. I'm going to read half a dozen poems um, related to May Day, related to workers, related to struggle, and of course, related to the pandemic in which we all find ourselves. I'm going to begin with a poem that was requested, but I would have read it anyway. It's a poem called Alabanza. Now, the word alabanza means praise in Spanish, and it's a 9/11 poem. But it's a 9/11 poem with a twist. The focus is on the food service workers who were killed that day, members of the union here, Local 100. Many of them immigrant, many of them undocumented, invisible in life and even more invisible in death, which is why I wrote the poem. Today, I look at that same poem and I see the quote, essential workers who are risking everything for us, the workers who have lost their jobs by the millions in the United States, the workers who have lost their lives, many of them immigrant, many of them undocumented, invisible in life, invisible in death. Again, the word alabanza means praise in Spanish. Alabanza, in praise of Local 100. For the 43 members of hotel employees and restaurant employees, Local 100, working at the Windows on the World restaurant, who lost their lives in the attack on the World Trade Center. Alabanza. Praise the cook with a shaven head and a tattoo on his shoulder that said, Oye. A blue-eyed Puerto Rican with people from Fajardo, the harbor of pirates centuries ago. Praise the lighthouse in Fajardo, candle glimmering white to worship the dark saint of the sea, Alabanza. Praise the cook's yellow pirate's cap worn in the name of Roberto Clemente, his plane that flamed into the ocean loaded with cans for Nicaragua, for all the mouths chewing the ash of earthquakes, Alabanza. Praise the kitchen radio, dial clicked even before the dial on the oven, so that music and Spanish rose before bread. Praise the bread, alabanza. Praise Manhattan from 107 flights up, like Atlantis glimpsed through the windows of an ancient aquarium. Praise the great windows where immigrants from the kitchen could squint and almost see their world. Hear the chant of nations. Ecuador, Mexico, República Dominicana, Haiti, Yemen, Ghana, Bangladesh, alabanza. Praise the kitchen in the morning where the gas burned blue on every stove and exhaust fans fired their diminutive propellers, hands cracked eggs with quick thumbs or sliced open cartons to build an altar of cans, alabanza. Praise the busboy's music, the chime of his dishes and silverware in the tub, alabanza. Praise the dish dog, the dishwasher who worked that morning because another dishwasher could not stop coughing or because he needed overtime to pile the sacks of rice and beans for a family floating away on some Caribbean island plagued by frogs, alabanza. Praise the waitress who heard the radio in the kitchen and sang to herself about a man gone, alabanza. Out of the thunder, wilder than thunder, out of the shudder deep in the glass of the great windows after the radio stopped singing like a tree full of terrified frogs after night burst the dam of day and flooded the kitchen. For a time, the stoves glowed in darkness like the lighthouse in Fajardo, like a cook's soul. Soul, I say, even if the dead cannot tell us about the bristles of God's beard, because God has no face. Soul, I say, to name the smoke beings flung in constellations across the night sky of this city and cities to come. Alabanza, I say, even if God has no face. Alabanza. When the war began, from Manhattan and Kabul, two constellations of smoke rose and drifted to each other, mingling in icy air, and one said with an Afghan tongue, "Teach me to dance. We have no music here." And the other said with a Spanish tongue, "I will teach you. Music is all we have." So we begin with alabanza, we begin with praise. And we move on to a man named Jorge. This next poem is based on a worker I knew from Honduras. He was a janitor in a church in Harvard Square, Cambridge, Massachusetts, that so-called bastion of liberalism. I present in this poem the dilemma of the thinking janitor. What if you have a mind and that mind works perfectly well, but you're only seen for what your hands can do? Part of the invisible army of essential workers today. I had many jobs like this. And so here I speak in his voice. The poem is called Jorge the Church Janitor Finally Quits. No one asks where I am from. I must be from the country of janitors. I have always mopped this floor. Honduras, you are a squatter's camp outside the city of their understanding. No one can speak my name. I host a fiesta of the bathroom, stirring the toilet like a punch bowl. The Spanish music of my name is lost when the guests complain about toilet paper. What they say must be true. I am smart, but I have a bad attitude. No one knows that I quit tonight. Maybe the mop will push on without me, sniffing along the floor like a crazy squid with stringy gray tentacles. They will call it Jorge. Some poems begin life as an argument. This next poem began life as an argument. It started with a photograph. Millions of people around the world have seen this photograph. The photograph of two migrants from the country of El Salvador, father and a daughter, last summer, who drowned crossing the Rio Grande River. They came to be known as Oscar and Valeria. And you may know about the I'm 1015 Border Patrol Facebook group with almost 10,000 members, where some said that photograph was faked, was staged. They engaged in trutherism. And they used a common Border Patrol term for drowned migrants that gives my next poem its name: Floaters. Epigraph. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and ask, have y'all ever seen floaters this clean? I'm not trying to be an ass, but I have never seen floaters like this. Could this be another edited photo? We've all seen the Dems and liberal parties do some pretty sick things. Anonymous post, I'm 1015, Border Patrol Facebook group. Like a beer bottle thrown into the river by a boy too drunk to cry. Like the shard of a styrofoam cup drained of coffee, brown is the river. Like the plank of a fishing boat broken in half by the river, the dead float. And the dead have a name. Floaters, say the men of the Border Patrol, keeping watch all night by the river, hearts pumping coffee as they say the word floaters, soft as a bubble, hard as a shoe as it nudges the body to see if it breathes, to see if it moans, to see if it sits up and speaks. And the dead have names. A feast day parade of names, names that dress all in red, names that twirl skirts, names that blow whistles, names that shake rattles, names that sing in praise of the saints. Say, Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez. Say, Angie Valeria Martinez Avalos. See how they rise off the tongue. The calling of bird to bird somewhere in the trees above our heads, trilling in the dark heart of the leaves. Say what we know of them, now they are dead. Oscar slapped dough for pizza with oven blistered fingers. Daughter Valeria sang, banging a toy guitar. He slipped free of the apron he wore in the blast of the oven, sold the motorcycle he would kick till it sputtered to life, counted off pesos for the journey across the river, and the last of his 25 years, and the last of her 23 months. There is another name that beats its wings in the heart of the trees. Say, Tania Vanessa Avalos, Oscar's wife and Valeria's mother, the witness, stumbling along the river. Now their names rise off her tongue. Say, Oscar y Valeria. He swam from Matamoros across to Brownsville. The girl slung around his neck, stood her in the weeds on the Texas side of the river, swore to return with a mother in hand, turning his back as fathers do, who later say, I turned around and she was gone. In the time it takes for a bird to hop from branch to branch, Valeria jumped in the river after her father. Maybe he called out her name as he swept her up from the river. Maybe the river drowned out his voice as the water swept him away. Tanya called out the names of the saints, but the saints drowsed in the stupor of birds in the dark, their cages covered with blankets. The men on patrol would never hear their pleas for asylum, watching for floaters, hearts pumping coffee all night on the Texas side of the river. No one, they say, had ever seen floaters so clean. Oscar's black shirt yanked up to the armpits, Valeria's arms slung around her father's neck, even after the light left her eyes, both face down in the weeds back on the Mexican side of the river. Another edited photo. See how her head disappears in his shirt, the waterlogged diaper bunched in her pants, the blue of the blue cans. The radio warned us about the crisis actors we see at one school shooting after another. The man called Oscar will breathe, sit up, speak, tug the black shirt over his head, shower off the mud, and shake hands with the photographer. Yet, the floaters did not float down the Rio Grande like Olympians showing off the backstroke, nor did their souls float up to Dallas, land of rumored jobs and a president shot in the head as he waved from his motorcade. No bubbles rose from their breath in the mud, light as the iridescent circles of soap that would fascinate a 2-year-old. And the dead still have names. Names that sing in praise of the saints, names that flower in blossoms of white, a cortege of names dressed all in black, trailing the coffins to the cemetery. Carve their names in headlines and gravestones they would never know in the kitchens of this cacophonous world. Enter their names in the book of names. Say Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez. Say Angie Valeria Martinez Avalos. Bury them in a corner of the cemetery named for the sainted Archbishop of the Poor, shot in the head saying Mass, bullets bought by the taxes I paid when I worked as a bouncer and fractured my hand 40 years ago, and bumper stickers read, El Salvador is Spanish for Vietnam. When the last bubble of breath escapes the body, may the men who speak of floaters, who have never seen floaters this clean, float through the clouds to the heavens, where they paddle the air as they wait for the saint who flips through the keys in his ring like a drowsy janitor till he fingers the key that turns the lock and shuts the gate on their babble-tongued faces, and they plunge back to earth, a shower of hailstones pelting the river, the Mexican side of the river. So that's what I have to say about that. And there's something else I have to say about that too. This is nothing new. The treatment of immigrants in this country has always been thus. In 1920, a payroll robbery took place at a shoe factory in South Braintree, Massachusetts. A paymaster and a payroll guard were killed. Two Italian immigrant anarchists, Nicola Sacco, a shoemaker, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, a fish peddler, were tried and convicted in an atmosphere of anti-immigrant bigotry and political hysteria. An international movement rose to free them. The judge, Webster Thayer, referred to the defendants as anarchist bastards and denied repeated motions for a new trial. They were finally executed in 1927. The former site of Charlestown State Prison in Boston, Massachusetts, where Sacco and Vanzetti were executed, is now the home of a school, Bunker Hill Community College. The school with a large immigrant population where I have often visited and read. And here's a poem this May Day about Sacco and Vanzetti. I now pronounce you dead. Poor Sacco and Vanzetti, executed August the 23rd, 1927. On the night of his execution, Bartolomeo Vanzetti, immigrant from Italia, fishmonger, anarchist, shook the hand of Warden Hendry and thanked him for everything. I wish to forgive some people for what they are now doing to me, said Vanzetti, blindfolded, strapped down to the chair that would shoot 2,000 volts through his body. The warden's eyes were wet. The warden's mouth was dry. The warden heard his own voice croak, "Under the law, I now pronounce you dead." No one could hear him. With the same hand that shook the hand of Bartolomeo Vanzetti, Warden Hendry of Charlestown Prison waved at the executioner, who gripped the switch to yank it down. The walls of Charlestown Prison are gone, to ruin, to dust, to mist. Where the prison stood, there is a school. In the hallways, tongues speak the Spanish of the Dominican, the Portuguese of Cabo Verde, the Creole of Haiti. No one can hear the last words of Vanzetti or the howl of thousands on Boston Common when they knew. After midnight, at the hour of the execution, Warden Hendry sits in the cafeteria. his hand shaking as if shocked, rice flying off his fork, so he cannot eat no matter how the hunger feeds on him, muttering the words that only he can hear. I now pronounce you dead. And for this May Day, I have a poem about my own work. I was a practicing tenant lawyer in Boston, and I went to Northeastern University Law School there. But many years before, I worked at a printing plant, making yellow legal pads by hand. And 10 years later, there I was. I found myself in law school, surrounded by a sea of legal pads and surrounded by people who had no idea how they got made. So this short poem is about the labor and the laborers we take for granted. It's called Who Burns for the Perfection of Paper? At 16, I worked after high school hours at a printing plant that manufactured legal pads. Yellow paper stacked 7 feet high and leaning as I slipped cardboard between the pages, then brushed red glue up and down the stack. No gloves. Fingertips required for the perfection of paper, smoothing the exact rectangle. Sluggish by 9 p.m., the hands would slide along suddenly sharp paper and gather slits thinner than the crevices of the skin, hidden. Then the glue would sting, hands oozing till both palms burned at the punch clock. 10 years later, in law school, I knew that every legal pad was glued with the sting of hidden cuts, that every open law book was a pair of hands upturned and burning. And I will read one more poem this evening. And once again, I'd like to thank VJ and Leftward and all of you out there watching and listening. This is my first collaboration with Leftward, and I hope it is not the last. This last poem has something to do with the pandemic and President Donald Trump. According to the New York Times, and these numbers change every day, of course, 63,000 people have now died in 8 weeks in the United States from COVID-19, surpassing the total American military dead in the Vietnam War. But Donald Trump is proud of the job he's done. Now, his negligence, his arrogance, his racism, his refusal to apologize or take responsibility, his interest in nothing but profit and power, are very familiar to Puerto Ricans like me. Why? Well, Donald Trump is now doing to the mainland United States exactly what he did to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria in the fall of 2017. At least 3,000 people died on that tiny island, a colony of the United States since 1898. My father, Frank Espada, was born in a mountain town called Utuado, Puerto Rico, in 1930. My grandmother was born in Utuado. My great-grandfather was the mayor of the same town, Utuado. John Lee Anderson, writing about Hurricane Maria in the New Yorker, said, the municipality of Utuado has become a byword for the island's devastation. It was destroyed. I wrote this last poem, Letter to My Father, in the fall of 2017, and yet, strangely enough, my father had died 3 years earlier. The poem evolved from the practice of talking to my father's ashes in a box. Frank Espada, my father, was an organizer. Frank Espada, my father, was a hellraiser. On May Day, let us not forget the organizers. Let us not forget the hellraisers. Let us not forget the people they lived and died to liberate. And so I present my final poem, Letter to My Father, October 2017. You once said, my reward for this life will be 1,000 pounds of dirt shoveled in my face. You were wrong. You are 7 pounds of ashes in a box, a Puerto Rican flag wrapped around you next to a red brick from the house in Utuado where you were born, all crammed together on my bookshelf. You taught me there is no God, no life after this life. So I know you are not watching me type this letter over my shoulder. I was a boy. You were God. I watched from the 7th floor of the projects as you walked down into the street to stop a public execution. A big man caught a small man stealing his car, and everyone in Brooklyn heard the car alarm wail of the condemned, "He's killing me!" At a word from you, the executioner's hand slipped from the hair of the thief. The kid was high, was all you said when you came back to us. When I was a boy and you were God, we flew to Puerto Rico. You said, my grandfather was the mayor of Utuado. His name was Buenaventura. That means good fortune. I believed in your grandfather's name. I heard the tree frogs chanting to each other all night. I saw banana leaf and elephant palm sprouting from the mountain's belly. I gnawed the mango's pit, and the sweet yellow hair stuck between my teeth. I said to you, you came from another planet. How'd you do it? You said, every morning, just before I woke up, I saw the mountains. Every morning, I see the mountains. And Utuado, 3 sisters, all in their 70s, all bedridden, all Pentecostales who only left the house for church, lay sleeping on mattresses spread across the floor when the hurricane gutted the mountain the way a butcher slices open a dangled pig, and a rolling wall of mud buried them, leaving the 4th sister to stagger into the street screaming like an unheeded prophet about the end of the world. In Utuado, a man who cultivated a garden of aguacate and carambola, feeding the avocado and star fruit to his nieces from New York, saw the trees in his garden beheaded all at once like the soldiers of a beaten army, and so hanged himself. In Utuado, a welder and a handyman rigged a pulley with a shopping cart to ferry rice and beans across the river where the bridge collapsed, witnessed the cart swaying above so many hands that raised a sign that told the helicopters, Campamento Los Olvidados, Camp of the Forgotten. Los Olvidados wait 7 hours in line for a government meal of Skittles and Vienna sausage, or a tarp to cover the bones of a house with no roof as the fungus grows on their skin from sleeping on mattresses drenched with spit of the hurricane. They drink the brown water, waiting for microscopic monsters in their bellies to visit plagues upon them. A nurse says, these people are going to have an epidemic. These people are going to die. The president flips rolls of paper towels to a crowd at a church in Guaynabo, Zeus lobbing thunderbolts on the locked ward of his delusions. down the block, cousin Ricardo, Bernice's boy, says that somebody stole his can of diesel. I heard somebody ask you once, Puerto Rico needed to be free, and you said, 3 pulgadas de sangre en la calle, 3 inches of blood in the street. Now, 3 inches of mud flow through the streets of Utuado, and troops patrol the town as if guarding the vein of copper in the ground, as if a shovel digging graves in the backyard might strike the ore below, as if La Brigada swinging machetes to clear the road might remember the last uprising. I know you are not God. I have the proof. 7 pounds of ashes in a box on my bookshelf. Gods do not die, and yet I want you to be God again. Stride from the crowd to seize the president's arm before another roll of paper towels sails away. Thunder Spanish obscenities in his face, banish him to a ruthless rainstorm in Utuado so he unravels one soaked sheet after another till there is nothing left but his cardboard heart. I promised myself I would stop talking to you, white box of gray grit. You were deaf even before you died. Hear my promise now. I will take you to the mountains where houses lost like ships at sea rise blue and yellow from the mud. I will open my hands. I will scatter your ashes in Utuado. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
You're not going anywhere yet. Thank you so much for that. That was beautiful. I wanted to ask you a few questions, if you don't mind, Martin. The first time I read your poetry, and I first want to talk to you about your poetry and then about perhaps a little bit about politics.
Okay.
The first time I read your poetry, I was struck by the storytelling. This is the cycle of poems on Patterson. And, one of the great penalties that we face as sensitive people of the left is that our history is taken away from us. We are unable to tell people our own history. We are being told lies about the past. And you have been able to excavate the radical history of the Americas and distill it into a different form, and give it back to people who may not know about a strike in Patterson or indeed, even more contemporary history, Hurricane Maria. Tell us a little bit about your relationship to excavating memory.
Well, I think that is absolutely an essential role of the poet, to excavate history, to make the invisible visible. I am a narrative poet. I have found a form in which to tell my stories, but I am not first. And I have been influenced by others who told stories and they weren't necessarily poets. Think, for example, of the great historian from Uruguay, Eduardo Galeano, and his trilogy on the history of Latin America, Memory of Fire. I learned so much from Galeano. I learned from my father, who was not only a raconteur, a storyteller, as you can tell from that last poem. All those quotes are actually literally his. He was a photographer. My father was the creator of something called the Puerto Rican Diaspora Documentary Project, the photo documentary of the Puerto Rican migration. And so he was excavating history, hidden history, untold history, because in this country, we keep better track of migratory birds than migratory people.
Wow.
And so I had a great influence right there in the household. And the notion that one's art could be turned to these ends was something that I was ingrained with growing up. As a matter of fact, it's just by sheer coincidence. My laptop is being held up by a copy of The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. And Howard was a very dear friend of mine. And I actually wrote 2 poems for him, one of which I delivered at his memorial service. And so, yeah, so happens Howard's here with us too. He's just underneath the laptop.
I mean, that's beautiful, Martin. That's it's nice to remember people like that who have played those sorts of roles. Obviously today is May Day, and May Day as an event is a uniquely American event. It takes place in Chicago in the Haymarket Square, but it's an event. It's a tradition that gets taken outside the United States. We grew up with it in India. It becomes something that the Soviets made a big deal of. It seems not to be a part of the fabric of America until immigration and immigrant rights people took it back, which is an interesting part of the story of American radicalism. So much of American radicalism is wrapped up in the immigrant story. I wonder if you could talk a little about that. It's already there in your Sacco and Vanzetti poem, but if you could just talk about the immigrant experience and American radicalism.
Well, the immigrant experience is absolutely necessary to the history of American radicalism. There would be no American radicalism without immigrants. And we can look at a very clear line that begins in the 19th century and comes right through to the present day. But I think of those immigrant silk workers who walked out in Patterson and struck there. I think of the Great Bread and Roses strike, likewise in Lawrence, Massachusetts, in 1912. Those were immigrants, and we take for granted in this country certainly the accomplishments of those immigrants and those strikers, even if those strikes happen to fail in the immediate moment. The Patterson Silk Strike was defeated, but a few years later, people were already implementing what was the major demand of those strikers, the 8-hour day. We wouldn't have it without waves and waves of strikes that were led by immigrants. And it continues into the present. Think about one of the great labor movements of the 20th century in any country, but particularly in the United States, Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers, and what that movement did in the 1960s, the 1970s, not only to move forward the cause of farm workers, but to move the cause for many of us. And those were, of course, Mexican workers. In the Puerto Rican community, we often talk about the tradition of radicalism there, which has been papered over because so many of those radicals were independentistas. They were in favor of or advocated the independence of Puerto Rico from the United States. And so they were repressed, they were jailed, they were killed, on and on and on. My father was an independentista. He believed in the independence of Puerto Rico. And yet there was this radical community at the heart of the Puerto Rican nation in New York City and beyond in the United States. We hear in this country often about the so-called greatest generation, which usually refers to the white men who fought in the Second World War. Well, the Puerto Rican community had its own greatest generation, and that was the generation of my father, who was born in 1930, and many other activists like him who were born in that decade and came of age in the 1950s and the 1960s and changed the Puerto Rican community, and so changed New York City, and so changed the United States for the better.
I love this word you used, hellraiser. Some of our words we use like militant or comrade and so on, they in the presence of a word like hellraiser, they seem a little bloodless. Could you tell us a little about the term Hellraiser? Is that a uniquely American term, or what is the story of that really delicious word?
It may very well be an Americanism. Hellraiser is just the first term that comes to mind when I think of my father. My father was not only a political organizer and an activist, he was a hellraiser. He filled up the room when he walked into it. He had that kind of presence. He had that kind of charisma. He was loud. He was funny. He was angry. He was angry a lot. And yet he channeled that anger into his art. He channeled that anger into his politics, and he made a great deal of difference. There are different styles of activism. I mean, some of the most effective organizers I've ever met are very soft-spoken. I once interviewed Cesar Chavez. He's a very soft-spoken man. But I love the Hellraisers. I love the ones who make a lot of noise. And who sometimes make other people very uneasy, very uncomfortable. I think we have to do that sometimes. I think we have to, especially those in power, we have to make them uneasy, make them uncomfortable. The other term that I've heard applied to me, aside from Hellraiser, is rabble rouser. I don't know if that's an Americanism or not, but I did a reading once with a famous poet, and he had to follow me, and afterwards he got up and he said, "I want to say something about Martin Espada," and he said, "I mean this as a compliment. Martin Espada is a rabble rouser." I guess I am.
By the way, I've seen you read in public, and I think that's not a bad, especially I've seen you read Alabanza in public, and boy, that the way you say Alabanza in public fills the room. And the way you read it now was filled with passion. So it's not a bad expression. I think both those expressions, Hellraiser and rabble rouser, they connote the ability to develop confidence in people, especially rabble rouser. You're developing confidence in people. And one of the things about the world that we live in is that people's confidence is eroded by the structure of life, everyday life, by the structure of maybe the fraying of social bonds and so on. The role of the organizer so frequently, or the militant, is to build confidence of people. And these expressions seem to suggest that rabble rouser, the one who rouses you, raises your confidence. And perhaps poets are also in that sense rabble rousers, regardless of how loudly they read.
Yes, I agree. Well, it does depend on the poetry, doesn't it? But I would agree that is part of my purpose. Certainly, is to raise awareness. And when we raise awareness, we are not only raising awareness of the issues that we bring to the table, we're raising awareness in the potentiality that people have inside themselves. And that's the confidence factor that you spoke of. And yes, we are now enduring a great crisis of faith. And it's a faith in governments, it's a faith in humanity, it's a faith in activism. All have been shaken. And yet they will survive these forms of faith. And it will begin with the confidence that we instill in ourselves and in each other to organize, to advocate, to push and to push hard for the world to which we're entitled. It is not a given that we're going to come out of this and things have to be the way they were. I mean, this is a cataclysm, but is a cataclysm from which may emerge something better in the long run. And it's our responsibility to be vigilant about that.
Last year there were major protests in Chile, and I know that Chile is important to you because you wrote very movingly about Neruda and his refuge up there. But there was during the middle of these protests, there was a slogan that I particularly liked, which said, "We don't want to return to normal because normal was the problem." And I feel like in the middle of this pandemic, that should be our slogan. We don't want to return to normal. Normal was the problem.
Absolutely. Normal is what got us into this problem in the first place. Whether it's the normal in the United States, the normal in India, it's the normal is what got us here. The fact that the system was broken, and being broken could not absorb what is happening now. And we are paying the price. We are seeing the consequence of that. But absolutely, we can insist on doing something new and doing something better. And we can call upon that earlier tradition of struggle to do it. You mentioned the fact that there were demonstrations in the streets of Chile against the regime now in power. One of the striking things I found about those demonstrations is that they were singing the songs of Victor Jara. Victor Jara, who along with Salvador Allende, they were the two most celebrated victims of the coup. September 11, 1973, the first 9/11, as I have to constantly remind people in this country. And the fact that these demonstrators were in the street singing the songs of Victor Jara tells you everything you need to know. They can resurrect the spirit of this slain communist singer-songwriter who left us such a beautiful legacy, and parenthetically, whose murder has finally now been solved. Then I believe anything is possible, whether it's the streets of Chile or even here in the intransigent United States of America.
It's been a great pleasure to have you, Martin. Martin Espada, one of the best poets of our time, a storyteller of our socialist tradition. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. It really has been an honor. And as I said, this is my first collaboration with Leftward, and I hope it is not the last.
No, definitely not the last.